Good morning, this is Michaela Swikowski, and my presentation is going to be on African American Vernacular English myths versus facts. So before we start getting into the myths, it's important to go over some definitions. So the first definition we want to look at is AAVE. So AAVE is African American Vernacular English. But it can also be called African American English, AAE, Black Standard English, BSE, African American Standard English, AASE. And all these can be found in Lippy Green on page 188. However, it's important to note that it is a dialect of English. It is not a different language. And then you'll see multiple times throughout this presentation SAE, which stands for Standard American English. And a few times I might mention bidialectal, which means that people are able to use two dialects of the same language. So they're not switching between languages, they're switching between dialects. And then there's been a huge debate over Ebonics, which simply means black speech, from ebony, which means black, and phonics, which means sound. And this was from Rickford. So let's get into the myths. Myth 1. It is primarily the language of the poor who live in large cities. That is not true. The fact is, AAVE speakers come from all socioeconomic backgrounds and circumstances. AAVE is predominantly spoken by African Americans, but it can be spoken by anyone raised in an African American community. So for example, in Lippy Green on page 186, they say, children and adolescents learn the language they hear around them, regardless of race or ethnicity. A blonde, blue-eyed child raised with African American playmates in an African American community where AAVE predominates will, in fact, learn AAVE. We also need to note that not all people who are of African ancestry speak AAVE. Myth 2. AAVE is spoken the same by everyone. The fact is, not everyone who speaks AAVE speaks it the same way. There are regional and social variations. Some examples that Libby Green gave on 188 and 189 were the rural South versus the urban South. So for example, in the urban South, the resultative be done is there. In the rural South, they do not have the resultative be done. And then there's also differences in the middle class versus lower class, East Coast versus West Coast. Myth 3. AAVE is just bad English. Fact of the matter is AAVE is not bad English, it is simply a different version of English. It is a dialect of English just like how the South has Southern American English dialect. Garcia in 2013 said, there is within the larger African community and in other communities various dialects. They have always been there and will probably always be there. And then there's other examples given by PBS Do You Speak American of dialects in the United States. So we have AAVE, we have Californian, Cajun, Chicano English, Lumbee, Midwest, New York City, Pacific Northwest, Pittsburghese, Texan, Spanglish, Smoky Mountain, and more. So the big debate is it's just bad English, so ask versus ax. According to Lippy Green on page 190, ax is assumed to be wrong and is only found in AAVE, so it's not proper English. However, it can be heard in Appalachian speak and some urban dialects in the New York metropolitan area and outside the U.S. in some regional variations of British English. So it is not incorrect. It is used other places as well. And Hobbs in 2017 said, dozens of other languages have the same structures. They're not incorrect, they just have different sets of rules than standard English. So AAVE is just different than English. It's just a dialect. It has same structures of some other languages as well. So it's not bad English, it is just a dialect of English, which means it is different. Myth 4. You cannot be successful if you speak AAVE. The fact is, there are many successful black actors, actresses, athletes, and so on who do speak AAVE. Anglo speakers have this skewed perception of AAVE. And Lippy Green gives an example, page 189, 190. For most Anglos, the primary and sometimes sole experience of African Americans comes through mass media. Those who do speak AAVE are seen primarily when someone, usually poor, victimized, or suspected of a crime, is interviewed. Mass media tells us that you cannot be successful if you speak a certain way, when in reality there are tons of successful people, such as LeBron James, Lil Wayne, Beyonce, Obama, Sylvia Fowles, and Kevin Durant. Myth 5. Famous people do not speak AAVE. The fact is, many famous black people do in fact speak AAVE. They have just learned to code switch based on their audience. Well, what is code switching? In short, from Selleck and Seltzer 2013, code switching is when a person is able to effortlessly switch from one language to another. So, are they code switching or are they code meshing? Well, code meshing is similar to translanguaging because it suggests that there are no boundaries between the different varieties in English. And this was in Lippy Green on page 199. So, famous people code switch. They use one kind of English when they talk to friends, family, peers, and they use another type of English when they speak to the media. So why do they do this? Lippy Green on page 202 says it best. Blacks who primarily speak AAVE are subject to ongoing pressure to assimilate to SAE norms in a number of settings outside their communities. In fact, they're threatened with exclusion if they do not. Blacks who do not speak AAVE may be treated with skepticism and distrust by other African Americans. Basically, influential people in society are trying to fit into both categories by code switching. They're trying to fit into mainstream society by using standard American English, and they're trying to maintain respect and trust from other African Americans by using AAVE. Myth 6. This is America, so everyone should speak English. Standard American English, that is. The fact of the matter is, the United States does not have an official language and is made up of many different cultures, religions, and languages. Telling someone they should not speak AAVE would be like telling someone from the South not to speak Southern American English. Lippy Green on page 209 says AAVE is tangible and irrefutable evidence that there is a distinct, healthy, functioning African American culture which is not white and which does not want to be white. Just like different populations have their communities and cultures in America, such as Cubans, Latinos, the Irish, and so many more, African Americans too have a culture unique to them. And the final myth, myth 7, the only difference in Standard American English and AAVE is grammar. That is wrong. The fact is, AAVE differs in many different ways from Standard American English. Well, how? Rickford tells us that it differs in grammar. So, for example, without present tense is and are, or they use double negatives. It also differs in phonics, the omission of the final consonant. So, for example, hand versus han. And then Lippy Green on page 182 gives us examples of syntactic structures, prosodic and rhetorical features, and intonation and pitch. So it is more than just grammar that differs AAVE from Standard American English. So those were 7 myths that are very common when discussing African American vernacular English, and so thought they were really important to address and to give the facts with some supporting information to really clear up these differences and to help learners understand. Here are my references. We used quite a few different resources that were given to us by Dr. Lilly, and I also went out and found my own. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.